Hello everybody, Chocolate Guy here, and welcome to my first countdown. Now, I've been watching a lot of Simpsons recently, and it has made me realize just how great this show was in its prime. But it didn't start out that way. Season 1 is completely different from the other seasons. It's much more like a traditional sitcom, along with having slower pacing and less jokes. They were really trying to figure out what they wanted this show to be around this time, which is usually what most first seasons do, but in this case, we have 30 other seasons to compare it to. The Simpsons is a show that changes a lot because of how long it's been on the air, which makes this very interesting, because season 1 is nothing like the other seasons of the show. That's why I wanted to make a video on it. While I do think The Simpsons really starts to get going in Season 2 like most people, I also think Season 1 definitely isn't that far behind, and you can find some of what makes later seasons great here. Though, there are many things missing. Season 2 is still a big step up, because this season was pretty undefined and experimental, and that led to a rough but decent first season that has its highs and lows. So that's what we're going to look at today. With everything I just said, this should be an interesting list to do. I hope you enjoy, and with that, let's get to my top 5 best and worst Simpsons Season 1 episodes. Number 5 worst. Bart the Genius. Now here's the thing. Not every episode on the worst list is bad. Honestly, the season is solid enough to the point where basically none of them are. Most of them are okay. So even though I like Bart the Genius and think it's a decent episode, it's still outshined by many other episodes here. While I love the concept for this episode, and respect the hell out of it for being the first Bart character study episode, along with having some great jokes. But what really lets this episode down is its pacing. There are 2 main plots in this episode. One about Bart ending up in a school for gifted children when he shouldn't be there, and the other about how this affects his relationship with his father. Both of these plots are very interesting, and give us our first real look into Bart's character. The problem is both of these plot lines don't get developed enough. It takes too long for either of them to get set up, and then when they do take effect, the episode doesn't spend as much time on them, but instead tries to tell jokes about other random things. Yes, the opening with Bart taking a test at his normal school, and the opera scene are funny, but they're not that funny, and they eat up so much time. So when stuff happens like Bart's friends turning on him because he went to this school, and Bart wanting to go back to his normal school because of this and other reasons, it just feels very out of nowhere and once again underdeveloped. I know this is a comedy show, but the joke shouldn't take away from the plot, especially in an episode that really feels like it lives or dies off the strength of its story. Because so much ends up happening in the episode. At the end of the episode, when Bart leaves the school and Homer gets mad at him, I just end up being like, I wish I could have gotten to see more of Bart's time at this school, or his relationship with Homer, so I could have cared more about this outcome. Once again, I do like this episode for showing us more of Bart's character through different ways, and for the many great, funny moments throughout. But the poor pacing involving the balancing of its story and comedy earned it a spot on this list. It just makes the story of this episode feel very underdeveloped, so when everything wraps up in the ending and the climax just ends up feeling underdeveloped as well. This was definitely testing for many better Bart-centric episodes to come. Number 5 best. Homer's Night Out. Now look, I get it. A lot of people don't like this episode. Some people might even call it the worst of the season. and I can definitely see why. The pacing is really strange, and the ending message is super schmaltzy. Also, parts of the episode are kinda dated. While I don't fully disagree with a lot of these points, I think this episode is just so much fun and too interesting for it to matter that much in the long run. It's an episode that tries to do a lot of things and succeeds at most of them. It goes from being a fun plot about Bart and his camera, to a marriage drama, to a story about not treating women as objects, and all these things are done pretty well, with a lot of great and funny moments. And even though it's paced really strangely, it's still able to tell a complete story that keeps you guessing. Which gives it an interesting feel that really sets it apart from everything else in season 1. I do just love how fun this episode is, and how ambitious it tries to be. It's just so engaging, and I love how it subverts your expectations because you never know exactly where it's gonna go next. And even when you do, it's just so interesting to see these three plots play off of each other decently well. Once again, it's not a perfect episode. The marriage stuff does take up a lot of time, and is kind of repetitive and dated, along with the pacing being very strange at points. The episode's plots do undermine each other a little because of this, making all three of them feel underdeveloped in places, especially the ending, which feels kind of out of nowhere and once again is way too schmaltzy for its own good. But the episode is still just a lot of fun, and has too many great jokes and moments, which makes most of the problems not bother me. Every time I go back to this episode, it keeps surprising me by just how different it is, while still having a great story and jokes. But I could totally understand why someone wouldn't like it, and its issues are why it's so low. Number 4 worst. The Call of the Simpsons. This is the most underwhelming episode of the season. It's an okay concept done in an okay way. That's about it, honestly. Okay, maybe it's a bit better than I'm making it sound. There are a lot of good jokes and cute moments that make this episode worth watching. But it's still just an episode of the different Simpsons family members being stuck in the woods and going on pretty generic and simple adventures. Except Maggie, who steals the show with her adorable subplot about bears. What I'm trying to get at here is that while this is a cute, simple episode with a lot of good jokes that make it worth watching once, it's still too simple and kinda dull to justify ever coming back to. Along with the dumb ending involving Homer being Bigfoot, and some pretty awful pacing at times, just adds to make this a pretty lackluster episode overall. Number 4 best. Krusty Gets Busted. This is one of the most ambitious episodes of the season. A really well done mystery with not a ton of jokes, though the jokes they do tell are hilarious. There's also a great underlying theme about how we treat people in show business and how they talk down to children. All of this makes for a fantastic episode with a few twists and legitimate tension. You don't want to see Bart's hero be sent to jail when you know he's innocent, so you're really invested to see Bart free Krusty. The episode is paced really well, though I do wish it was paced better in some places. While the episode does a good job making you doubt Krusty's innocence and hides who actually did it, from the very beginning, you still know who did it and who was behind the entire thing. So I wish they would have dropped the mystery aspect a little, so we could have gotten to see more of Sideshow Bob throughout the episode to build up his and Bart's awesome confrontation at the end. So the climax and his interesting spiel about not talking down to children at the end of the episode would have meant more. As usual, Sideshow Bob is great here, but this isn't his best appearance because he doesn't really show up until Act 3. But that's a really minor issue, and I love everything else about this episode. It is still a really impressive episode that introduces Sideshow Bob in a great way, but there are 3 others this season that impress me even more. Number 3 worst. Some Enchanted Evening. This episode is the pure definition of okay. Everything about it is fine. The marriage drama is fine, but kinda generic. The babysitter plotline is alright, but underwhelming and underwritten. The setup is decent, and so is the ending. Even the animation is okay. I mean, some of it is kind of piss poor, but a lot of it is fine. I really don't have anything else to say. It's the most middle-of-the-road episode of the season, and not because it has a lot of good or bad things going for it, but because everything is just okay. Though it still has a lot of pacing and writing issues. The stories are all really underdeveloped and don't go together that well. It is just a nice ensemble piece that shows off The Simpsons during one special evening. And as I've said, it does all of this stuff just fine. But that's about it. There's a ton of issues weighing it down, and there's no interesting edge or something to make it much better, like the Call of the Simpsons or Bart the Genius, to make up for some of its problems. It's not bad by any means, because none of the problems fully ruins anything in the episode, but it's super underwhelming and not really worth watching because of that. Once again, it's 100% middle of the road, and there are much worse things you could be, but it still definitely deserves to be here. Number 3 best. Simpsons roasting on an open fire. This episode is such a classic in every way. If Some Enchanted Evening does everything in the most okay way possible, then this episode does everything in the best way possible. It's a great first episode and one of the best animated Christmas specials of all time. Up there with Arnold's Christmas. The reason being because of how down-to-earth it is. It really puts a spin on what most Christmas specials tried to do at the time, and shows Homer after not getting his Christmas bonus and losing all his money, going through different things to try to get his family the bare minimum of a Christmas. It's a really engaging story that makes you care for Homer. So much happens, and there are so many little twists to keep it interesting, and they make you doubt Homer is going to make everything work in the end. Also, this episode is surprisingly really funny for the first of the series. Because so much happens, there's a lot of time to make different jokes, which makes every scene feel more memorable and distinctive from each other. Even every Simpsons family member gets at least one defining moment. This episode just hits the perfect balance between story and comedy, which is so impressive for this early on, especially because it also has to introduce us to all our characters and make them interesting, which it also does extremely well. Yes, this episode is not perfect. It is a bit rough around the edges in places, like most first episodes are, and the ending is a little anticlimactic. But who cares? It's still a sweet ending that serves its purpose well and does a good job wrapping up the episode. And I can't really think of how they would have done it better. This, to me, will always stand as one of the best Simpsons episodes, one of the best first episodes of any show, and one of the best Christmas specials to boot. But there are still 2 episodes this season I think are better. Number 2 worst. Homer's Odyssey. This is the most uneven episode of the season. If Some Enchanted Evening falls right in the middle because everything is just okay with some issues, then this episode lands here because there's an even amount of good and bad things. On the one hand, this episode has a pretty good look into depression and has a great story of finding something you're passionate in during one of your darkest periods. There are also a lot of funny little moments, whether intentional or not. And while these things do work in the episode's favor very well, that doesn't change the fact that this is the worst paced and animated episode of the season. The scene of Bart going on a field trip is too long and has nothing to do with the rest of the episode. This leads to everything else being really underdeveloped. Both things about Homer being depressed and making the city safer don't get enough time to play out because of this, and both plots don't end up playing off of each other. This really shows when Homer tries to kill himself in front of his entire family, 10 and 8-year-old kids included. Then they immediately cut to something different and never address what happened. It makes it really hard to take this new plot of Homer being safety man seriously when moments ago he tried to kill himself in front of his family. I know not everyone will feel the way I do, but this should prove how bad the pacing is when both plot lines have nothing to do with each other but also counteract each other and make one another hard to take seriously, while also being underdeveloped because it takes too long to get to either of them. Well, the pacing is the biggest issue, and trust me, it's a big one. I do need to comment on the animation. It's more minor overall, but it's pretty piss poor here. The models look very off and stilted, along with the backgrounds. There are many scenes that just don't look right on a very basic level, and it's so distracting. I know we all laugh at how bad this crowd shot looks, but good God, this is horrible. With all that said, why is Homer's Odyssey not number one? Well, I do still stand by the good things I mentioned. Even if the pacing is bad, I like Homer's story. I want to see him succeed and get out of his rut. Yes, it's not the most complex story, but I'm always engaged watching. And on its own, it shows off the depressed and passionate side of Homer very well. Also, even if the episode's plots contrast each other too much, I love how ambitious the episode tries to be, by it showing these two very different times in Homer's life back to back, and giving us a very serious look into depression. It makes the episode more interesting and makes me respect it a lot more for trying this weird plot structure. And the problems I can point out will not change that. There's just too much to admire here for me to call it a bad episode, which is why it's not number one. But oh man, was it very close. Number 2 best. Life on the Fast Lane. Choosing between my number 1 and 2 spots was very difficult, because I had to choose between the episode which I thought was the best overall, and the one I enjoyed watching and got more out of. And in the end, I went with the latter for number 1 and put Life on the Fast Lane here. But before I reveal what topped it, let me explain why Life on the Fast Lane is a masterpiece and easily one of the best Simpsons episodes. Life on the Fast Lane just gets everything right and is the best marriage crisis episode of the series because of it. It's got a great plot that really puts Marge and Homer's relationship to the ultimate test. At the beginning of the episode, you get to see how naive, selfish, but well-meaning Homer is on Marge's birthday when he gives her a bowling ball made for him that he thinks she may like, but knows if she doesn't, he will get it for himself. This shows why Marge is so fed up with him and annoyed after having to put up with this kind of stuff for so many years. It shows all of Homer's issues in one horrible moment and how self-centered he is and how he's unable to think about the feelings and emotions of other people around him, especially his wife. The episode does a good job setting up how dumb Homer is before this scene to make it even more awkward and awful. This is a great opening to the episode and shows us everything wrong with their marriage, along with setting up a disconnect between them which lasts throughout the entire thing. But this is where Jacques comes in. Jacques is an amazing character who is a great love interest for Marge. Him being the exact opposite of Homer makes it even better. He's just so devious but charming. You fully understand why Marge would fall for a guy like this, especially after she was treated so poorly by her own husband. This episode also shows how her hanging out with him affects Homer and the kids in a negative way, which no other marriage episode really shows, while still having joke after joke to keep the episode from getting too depressing, but not taking away from the complexity of this story. This is the funniest episode of the season, and also the most detailed. There are so many little things you won't notice without watching it more than once. That's in part because of the great animation, which really took a step up in this episode, and the art direction, along with every scene being paced perfectly, so it conveys fully what it's trying to accomplish. The slow opening with the bowling ball falling on the cake is so perfectly timed, and the silence after it adds to the awkwardness. All the scenes with Marge and Jacques are nice and romantic, but also strangely casual, thanks to Marge's very slow transition into being attracted with him, which adds a level of comedy to those scenes. But even with all that said, the reason why this episode is so great is because it is from Marge's perspective. The reason why this kind of story doesn't work as well for Homer is because I get the sense Homer respects Marge too much for being the first woman to ever see anything in him, and how hard he had to work to get her to love him back. Because of that, I could just never see Homer leaving Marge, because he just respects her so much. So even if another lady comes into his life who does love him, I don't think he would ever actually choose her. With Marge, I always get the idea that she's settled. Yes, she loves Homer, but you always get the sense she could have done much better than him. So when the better option does show up, I always have doubts about what choice she will make. Even though I know I'm still watching The Simpsons, even if I see the ending coming from a mile away, I'm still always surprised, but happy she chooses Homer, who truly does love and respect her, but just doesn't always know how to show it. Instead of her choosing Jacques, who seemed nice, but only really wanted one thing from her. But I still feel like she was super close to choosing him, which makes the final scene an even better ending. What else can I even say? Almost everyone loves this episode, and it's popular for a reason. It's the best animated, the best paced, the best written, and it's got a great guest star to boot. If this is your favorite episode of the season, then that's absolutely fantastic. But it was never going to be mine. Number 1 worst. There's no disgrace like home. This is the only episode of the season I would call bad. Even Homer's Odyssey, as bad as that episode was in places, there were still enough redeeming qualities so I could call it, at the very least, an okay episode. So why is this the only bad episode of the season, which caused it to be number 1 on this list? Well, it's because of 3 main issues. The big one is that this episode has aged the worst out of everything else this season. Yes, The Simpsons is a show that constantly changes, but there's still a set standard they try to hold their characters to, even if not always. At least seasons 1 through 8 tried to do this. And yes, this is season 1, and I already said that it's allowed to get away with weird inconsistencies. But every other episode this season, even if the characters act a little weird, it's not that out of line with what they'll later become. Homer's Odyssey is a great example of Homer's actions being kind of weird, but not too off from how he would act in this situation in later seasons. For the most part. But the Homer in this episode is nothing like he is in any other point in the series. He is so out of character here, and it makes it hard to take this plot seriously when the idiot dad character wants his family to be better and less embarrassing. It's so annoying to watch, and is a real deal breaker. Once again, season 1 can get away with stuff like this, but what really irks me about this choice is that this feels out of character from how Homer acts in every other episode in season 1. He never acts like this in any other point in the season. So even in the context of just this season, it doesn't work. Why they couldn't have just used Marge, who even at this early point would have fit this plot so much better, I have no idea. While this is my main problem that ruins the episode's plot completely for me and makes it hard to take seriously, that doesn't change the fact that even with that, this is just a boring plot. It's the most basic family drama plot, with not much intrigue to get you engaged. What most family drama episodes later in the show do is obviously have Marge as the main character, who's the embarrassed one, and adds another interesting element to make it engaging. Along with the episode centering around a character who doesn't fit his role, the episode has no interesting element to add any stakes. What happens if the therapy session works? Literally nothing. What happens if it doesn't work? Literally nothing. And that's how the episode ends. The rest of the episode is just Homer bad-mouthing his family and them walking around the neighborhood, which is so boring. Honestly, if they wanted to tell this simple of a story, then once again they should have had Marge be the main character. Even if I ignore the fact that Homer doesn't fit this role at all, I still have to admit there's no benefit or reason to having him in this role. Maybe it was for comedy to show how he's a hypocrite, but the episode doesn't play into that at all. Not even once, which makes his role even more baffling and make less sense. While there are jokes in this episode, the episode's plot isn't played really for laughs. It's told pretty straight as a serious story up until the end. And with that said, Homer is just too simple of a character to add anything in a positive way. He is just the simple, I'm an embarrassed parent character, and that's it. Marge would have added the conflict of her being a hard-working parent who is underappreciated by her husband and kids. So when those people who she works so hard to take care of embarrass her in public, she gets mad and wants her family to be less crazy and more respectful. See what I just did? I made the episode 10 times better and more interesting and added an additional character conflict for the episode. But even with all those problems I mentioned, what makes it all 10 times worse and sealed the deal for this episode being the #1 spot was its pacing. I hate the setup to this episode. The company picnic isn't the longest thing in the world, but eats up so much time and is so generic. Of course Burns is allowed to win the bag race. Of course the family embarrasses themselves. Yes, the setup in Homer's Odyssey might be worse because it has less to do with the rest of the episode and might eat up a little bit more time, but it does have more and better jokes, which makes it at the very least more entertaining. This just basically has nothing going for it, and the episode only gets worse from there. The scenes of the family talking about their issues and walking around the neighborhood is once again slow and boring, which leads to the ending therapy scene, which is super underwhelming. Yes, it's a funny scene, the best scene of the episode, and it's what most people remember this episode for. But once again, I stand by my point that it's pretty underwhelming in the grand scheme of things, and ends the episode off on a nothing of an ending. So with that said, it's no wonder why I don't like this episode. But before I wrap this segment up, I should say I don't hate this episode. There are many good things about it. The art direction in this episode is great and makes every scene a bit more interesting. Also, the episode tries to tell a lot of jokes and succeeds at most of them, even if they're not enough to save any scene and not all of them work. Another thing that I'll give this episode is it's an important one for setting up the family dynamic for the rest of the show, even if it's inconsistent and flawed here. My last point in the episode's favor is that even if I think the therapy scene is overrated and kind of a disappointing scene to end the episode on that doesn't wrap anything up, I have to admit it is still funny and well done. It's perfectly paced, animated, and as I've already said, the best scene of the episode, and the only scene that's actually great. Even if I don't love how it ends the episode, and think it could have been much funnier. But even with these positives, this is still the only bad episode of the season in my eyes, which earned it the number 1 spot on this worst list. Number 1 best. Moaning Lisa. By all accounts, Life on the Fast Lane should be number 1. And it was really close to reaching that spot. But I can't deny how much I love everything about Moaning Lisa, and how it has always been one of my personal favorite episodes of The Simpsons. Before I explain why, I want to say right off the bat that Lisa is one of my favorite characters in early Simpsons. She's just usually more interesting than Bart and Homer when her stories are written well, and a lot of her episodes go much more in depth with their plots. She is also the character I find myself relating or connecting to her problems the most. I'm not saying I can relate to what this episode is about directly, but it does hit me very emotionally like not a lot of other episodes do, and I can relate to certain aspects of this episode. This episode gets very introspective about Lisa's sadness and how her being smart for her age and understanding complex things while still having the mindset of a child makes it hard for her to live life day to day, which makes her really sad and feel helpless that she's able to grasp complex things but can't do anything about it because she is a kid. She has trouble finding meaning in her life because of this. This episode really isn't that funny, and it's not the best paced episode, but I'd be damned if it wasn't the most interesting and engaging. I love Lisa's story and the subject matter of this episode. I find her struggle with sadness so interesting, and the first half of the episode does a great job just showing Lisa live her life with her issues, and perfectly sets up why she is so sad, and how her family does so little to help, along with being just so naive to her problems. Marge thinks bottling your emotions up is a good idea, so she is super distant, and Homer's more concerned with beating Bart at a video game than actually talking to his daughter and helping her sort out her issues. This adds to Lisa's sadness in an interesting way, and while the episode is strangely paced because it is just Lisa living her life for the most of it, I think it adds a rawness to this story we don't get to see in any other Simpsons episode, at the time or later. All this amazing setup and an interesting character study of Lisa and a showcase of her problems and how her life and family affect it leads to the blues scene with Bleeding Gums Murphy. This scene is great, not because Bleeding Gums is that interesting of a character, but because he is such a cool contrast to Lisa. While they both have passion for jazz, they're both also in very different situations. One is an 8-year-old dealing with her emotions, and the other is an old jazz performer who has lived a pretty long and eventful life, with some ups and downs. But he gives her great advice about what she can do to make her life better, and when they play and sing about their problems together, even if they're very different, they're still given the same weight and respect. Not only is this the best scene of the season because of how introspective and complex it is, but it also helps Lisa realize she can express her feelings in a healthy way through her interests, and it's okay to feel sad about things other people wouldn't and express her feelings as long as she doesn't let that ruin her life, which makes what happens next even sadder. Marge takes her to school the next day and tells her the exact opposite, that she should cover up her feelings and put on a smile so no one can know that she's sad. And so people will like her, because Marge was taught a similar thing when she was a kid. But when she sees Lisa being taken advantage of, she can't take it, and tells Lisa that she can feel how she wants to feel, and that her mom will do the smiling for both of them. This shows to Lisa that her parents do care about her dearly, even if both of them aren't always the most aware of her issues. And the episode ends with her finally being happy watching a Bleeding Gums Murphy concert where he sings her song, and now she knows that it's okay to feel the way she feels about things, and also learns how to express that in a healthy way. I will say this isn't a perfect episode. Even if I love the pacing and think it works in the episode's favor, it is still really rough around the edges in places, along with being very slow and kind of repetitive. So if you don't find the subject matter as interesting as I do, then that can be a drawback. But I find it so interesting that everything I just said enhances the episode for the better, because I love this plot so much. The thing that does kind of bother me, though, was I wish Homer would have played a bigger part in Lisa's main story. Well, I love his subplot and think it keeps the episode from getting too dark and depressing, and shows how naive Homer is to his daughter's problems when he's having a wacky adventure of the week while his daughter is going through something really important, and it makes the episode more interesting because how different tone-wise the two plots are from each other, along with showing the disconnect between Homer and Lisa. The plot adds nothing but good things to the episode because of these reasons, and doesn't take away from Lisa's struggle. But I wish Homer would have had one more scene at the end proving he cares about Lisa and her problems. We know Marge deeply does, and through this, we refer that Homer does too, but it just feels like this episode needed one more scene to wrap this up. Oh well, I guess that's what Season 2 is for. But that's only a minor issue with this episode, and I adore everything else here. It's one of the best character study episodes of The Simpsons, and honestly of any show ever, diving so deep into Lisa's character and making her feel so real while dealing with a very down-to-earth but extremely complex subject matter. It's so raw and shows off all the very upfront but very subtle aspects of Lisa's character. Because of this, the story and the character development manages to be honestly really deep, while still being funny and charming in a subtle way. It's in-depth but subtle about aspects when it needs to be, and tiptoes the line between these two things perfectly. But what really pushed it over the edge is because it uses the fact it's a Season 1 episode to its advantage like nothing else this season. Simply put, it's great because it's a season 1 episode. That, along with everything else, and how relatable this plot is to me and many other people who have been in similar situations or mindsets at some point in their life, really pushed it over the edge and is why it is easily my number 1. Life on the Fast Lane might be the more well-rounded episode, but in the end of the day, it wasn't even close to topping this masterpiece. And with that, the list is done. Thank you so much for watching. I know the video was really long. This list took me forever to make, but I loved every second of it, and I can't wait to make more TV show lists in the future. So if you enjoyed this, please like the video and subscribe for more content similar to this in the future. Also, leave a comment telling me what you thought of my list and what your own list would have been, along with your thoughts on Season 1 as a whole. My next video is going to be about the best and worst episodes of Simpsons Season 2, so until then, this is Chocolate Guy, signing off.